significant event within the book of Exodus. So I thought, hey, that'd be cool. Why don't we take this class again? It'll be an encore type presentation, and we'll probably time it pretty decently to where our study on the people passing through the Red Sea should coincide pretty well with where Pastor Marcus is as he's marching through the book of Exodus. And then March hit. And when March hit, as you recall, we were essentially in what began as pre-lockdown mode, then lockdown mode, then no Sunday school, then whatnot. At the time, February 15th, we had heard of coronavirus, that pesky thing that was happening in China, maybe starting to make some waves beyond the actual country of China, seemed a very distant and remote issue. Again, then came March. Now we are here in the middle of July. Coronavirus is unfortunately alive and well and taking too many statistical advantages of our country and even our local community here in Duval. But it makes for, I think, a more appropriate timing for this class. Yes, we're still in the book of Exodus as Pastor Marcus teaches through, but this class, if you hold the cover up, you'll see that the subtitle is 10 God-Given Strategies for Difficult Times. I wasn't contemplating that we all would be living through difficult times on February 15th when this book was selected, nor in April 1 when we were planning to start this class. Now we all are, to varying degrees. I know some of you here and some that'll be attending remotely are dealing with some very specific difficult times, some specific health issues, yourself or your family. But all of us are dealing with a life upheaval of sorts as a result of COVID-19. All of us have been affected to some extent, some to a large extent. So I think that God's timing was better than mine by far in allowing this class to be taught 3 months later than planned. So we could not be studying these things in the abstract. It's one thing to take a Bible study class and to learn teaching moments that I'll file away and hopefully I can recall when I'm in that moment. Well, we're now in this moment. We are in the moment of difficult times. So we don't have to file this away and hope that our brain cues it up. We're going to be able to, I hope, learn, understand, and apply these lessons very readily, very, very presently. So that's just a little bit of background on how this class came about and why and God's alteration of those plans. For housekeeping purposes, you all see the signage up here. We would like for you all to remain, to sit during the worship service where you're sitting now. You're not tied down for 2 hours. You can get up and go to the bathroom or whatever. But when you come back, when you come back to worship, please sit there. We don't want people sitting in multiple different spots. That just creates some sanitation issues and concerns. So sorry if this is not where you were planning to sit this Sunday. Just hunker down this Sunday. Next Sunday when you come, you can sit wherever, maybe your desired spot. But we do want you to try to sit in a place that you'll plan to stay in for the worship service. That'll be a help to us. I will be talking some to the camera up there for the folks attending live stream. So don't be spooked by the fact that I'm looking up and not looking at you. For those who are attending live stream, we have a lot of books. So if you're not planning to be here live to start or really at all, that doesn't mean you don't have a book. So please call the church and speak to Gina about arranging a time to get your copy of the book and the reading schedule so you can follow along with us even if you're not here sitting in a pew. All right, so with that, let's go ahead and cue up the actual passage that we're going to be primarily dissecting. It's out of the book of Exodus, chapter 13. We'll have that displayed on the screen, but for those of you with Bible or digital device in your lap and you want to read it in your own translation, go ahead and open to Exodus chapter 13. We'll begin reading in verse 17. I'll read aloud, but I'd like you to follow along. All right. Exodus 13, beginning in verse 17. I'm going to we will read through chapter 14, verse 31. So a little longer passage than I would normally just chunk into, but here we are. All right, beginning, verse 17. When Pharaoh let the people go, God did not lead them on the road through the Philistine country, though that was shorter. For God said if they face war, they might change their minds and return to Egypt. So God led the people around by the desert road toward the Red Sea. The Israelites went out of Egypt armed for battle. Moses took the bones of Joseph with him because Joseph had made the sons of Israel swear an oath. He said, God will surely come to your aid, and then you must carry my bones up with you from this place. After leaving Succoth, they camped at Etham on the edge of the desert. By the day, the Lord went ahead of them in a pillar of cloud to guide them on their way, and by night in a pillar of fire to give them light, so that they could travel by day or by night. Neither the pillar of cloud by day nor the pillar of fire by night left its place in front of the people. Then the Lord said to Moses, tell the Israelites to turn back and encamp near Pi-Haroth. I'll do my best with these. Between Migdol and the sea. They are to encamp by the sea, directly opposite Baal-Zephon. Pharaoh will think the Israelites are wandering around in the land in confusion, hemmed in by the desert. And I will harden Pharaoh's heart, and he will pursue them. But I will gain glory for myself through Pharaoh and all his army, and the Egyptians will know that I am the Lord. So the Israelites did this. When the king of Egypt was told that the people had fled, Pharaoh and his officials changed their minds about them and said, what have we done? We have let the Israelites go and have lost their services. So he had his chariot made ready and took his army with him. He took 600 of the best chariots, along with all the other chariots of Egypt, with officers over them. The Lord hardened the heart of Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, so that he pursued the Israelites who were marching out boldly. The Egyptians, all Pharaoh's horses and chariots, horsemen and troops, pursued the Israelites and overtook them as they camped by the sea near Pi-Haroth, opposite Baal-Zephon. As Pharaoh approached, the Israelites looked up, and there were the Egyptians marching after them. They were terrified and cried out to the Lord. They said to Moses, was it because there were no graves in Egypt that you brought us out into this desert to die? What have you done to us by bringing us out of Egypt? Didn't we say to you in Egypt, leave us alone, let us serve the Egyptians? It would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the desert. Moses answered the people, do not be afraid. Stand firm, and you will see the deliverance the Lord will bring to you today. The Egyptians you see today, you will never see again. The Lord will fight for you. You need only to be still. Then the Lord said to Moses, why are you crying out to me? Tell the Israelites to move on. Raise your staff and stretch out your hand over the sea and divide the water so that the Israelites can cross through the sea on dry ground. I will harden the hearts of the Egyptians so that they will go in after them. And I will gain glory through Pharaoh and all his army, through his chariots and his horsemen. The Egyptians will know that I am the Lord when I gain glory through Pharaoh, his chariots, and his horsemen. Then the angel of God, who had been traveling in front of Israel's army, withdrew and went behind them. The pillar of cloud also moved from in front and stood behind them, coming between the armies of Egypt and Israel. Throughout the night, the cloud brought darkness to one side and light to the other, so that neither went near the other all night long. Then Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and all that night the Lord drove the sea back with a strong east wind and turned it into dry land. The waters were divided, and the Israelites went through the sea on dry ground, with a wall of water on their right and on their left. The Egyptians pursued them, and all Pharaoh's horses and chariots and horsemen followed them into the sea. During the last watch of night, the Lord looked down from the pillar of fire and cloud at the Egyptian army and threw them into confusion. He made the wheels of their chariots come off so that they had difficulty driving. And the Egyptians said, let us get away from the Israelites. The Lord is fighting for them and against Egypt. Then the Lord said to Moses, stretch out your hand over the sea so that the waters may flow back over the Egyptians and their chariots and horsemen. Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and at daybreak the sea went back to its place. The Egyptians were fleeing toward it, and the Lord swept them into the sea. The water flowed back and covered the chariots and horsemen, the entire army of Pharaoh that had followed the Israelites into the sea. Not one of them survived. But the Israelites went through the sea on dry ground with a wall of water on their right and on their left. That day the Lord saved Israel from the hands of the Egyptians, and Israel saw the Egyptians lying dead on the shores. When the Israelites saw the great power of the Lord displayed against the Egyptians, the people feared the Lord and put their trust in him and in Moses, his servant. All right, so long passage, familiar passage, but again, the book walks through this passage and pulls out 10 very timely, I thought really potent lessons from this episode in Israel's history and our history that we can apply to our difficult times, including presently. An introductory comment within the book that you just received and have not yet read, the author made this comment in the preface. He said, as I walked through the chapter, meaning Exodus 14, 10 rules unfolded like rubber life rafts, 10 ways of handling dilemmas and discouragements, a divine protocol for handling life when we find ourselves caught between the devil and the deep Red Sea. I found them then, as I have found them since, a powerful and effective strategy for coping with the messes and stresses of life. I just love that last, the messes and stresses of life. So long before I studied this book and taught this book, I was in my own professional messes and stresses of life. I was hitting a particular roadblock that was very frustrating to me professionally, impacting me more than that. And I was wrestling with the issue of whether or not I had strayed from the path I sincerely believe God had set me on years prior. And it's not an illogical thought. As you all may have encountered in your life, you start off feeling God said, start here, go there, you're going there, but things are just not rosy. There's obstacles in your way. You're not hitting the success you want, or the opportunities aren't there, or you're not engaging the people like you thought, or whatever your mission was when you started here and went there, it just doesn't seem to be happening like you planned. That's where I was. It was back in Pastor Ed days, so that tells you how long ago, 2002-ish, 3-ish, wrestling with this issue. And as I did, and with some guidance from him, but mostly guidance from here, I began a thorough review, and I found myself gravitating towards the life story, the biblical life story of 4 gentlemen, all of whose names begin with J. So now in my mind, I categorize these lessons from the 4 J's of the Bible that spoke to this issue. I started here and I went there just like you said, and why in the world am I hitting roadblock and wall and difficulty and, in my mind, defeat? What the world? So I'm going to share some of those with you. That's what we're going to be doing for our first 2 classes. So the first J character that I want to talk about is the prophet Jonah. The reason why I named my son over this is, as some of you heard that lesson, but nonetheless, the prophet Jonah was one of the folks from whom I extracted a valuable lesson on this topic. And as we think about Jonah and we think about the difficult time he faced, the main difficulty he encountered during what we know of Jonah was what? This is an open class. What was the main thing he encountered that was most would call fairly difficult? Anybody? Yeah, that's why, but he found himself in a whale. Well, that's a fairly difficult scenario. Most of us, wouldn't identify with that per se. Jonah chapter 1, verses 15 through 17. Do we have those to queue up? Great. So this is after, I'm going to dive in the middle of the story, then we're going to backtrack and forward track and all that. So Jonah 1, verse 15. Then they took Jonah and threw him overboard, and the raging sea grew calm. At this, the men greatly feared the Lord, and they offered a sacrifice to the Lord and made vows to him. Now the Lord provided a huge fish or whale, depending on your translation, to swallow Jonah, and Jonah was in the belly of this fish 3 days and 3 nights. Bang. All right, so none of us are going to have that experience. But that was Jonah's. That was his difficult experience. That was his challenge in life. So as I looked at Jonah and I was dissecting Jonah, again, in light of am I having these difficulties because I left the path God set me on? Jonah provides us one answer to that scenario. And in Jonah's answer, as Dusty was suggesting, his difficulty was obedience because he was disobedient. The reason he's sitting there in the belly of a whale or a fish, as your translation says, is because he defied God's orders. Specifically, Jonah chapter 1, verses 1 through 4. If you can cue those up, please. The word of the Lord came to Jonah, son of Amittai. Go to the great city of Nineveh and preach against it, because of its wickedness has come up before me. But Jonah ran away from the Lord and headed for Tarshish. He went down to Joppa, where he found a ship bound for the port. After paying the fare, he went aboard and sailed for Tarshish to somewhere else. Then the Lord sent a great wind on the sea, and such a violent storm arose that the ship threatened to break up. And then verse 12. We have it. So then this is what preceded what we just said. All right, so before I even read verse 12. So again, the directive that God gave to Jonah, and Jonah, the book identifies Jonah as a prophet, which implies God had already used him. This is not like his first time gig. God comes to him. The implication is he's been a faithful servant. He's communicated God's word. Wherever that was, we don't know. This particular assignment, go to Nineveh. Now, Nineveh was the capital city of Assyria, and Assyria were enemies of the Israelites. Greatly so. And I don't have time to do that in this particular class, but if you walk through several passages, speak to the history of the Assyrians and the Israelites, and it was not a pretty history. And it was oppression from Assyria to Israel one way, always one way. Assyrians were pillaging them, they were plundering their crops, they were taking their people, they were extracting usury, money from the Israelites, just bad. So when this assignment comes to Jonah, go to Nineveh. He knows where Nineveh is. He knows whose people live in Nineveh, and he's not particularly interested in this assignment. So as we see, he decided, no, I'm not going to do that. And not only am I not going to not do that, I'm going to flee. And I'm going to go away from God's assignment. And not only that, I'm going to go in the opposite direction. And I'm going to get on a boat and go really as far as mankind knew the world to be at that point. He was sailing to a place that is, as we understand it now, on the coast of Spain, which would be facing the northern Atlantic Ocean. And if you're standing there looking out, you just see water. And if you live there, you think this is the end of the world. So Noah gets on a boat, and he's heading to just the flat opposite direction. He doesn't want anything to do with Nineveh or the Assyrians. I hate those people. That's kind of how his mind is thinking. So a clear defiance. As we look at Jonah, as I looked at Jonah in this scenario, and I thought about, gosh, he was in a bad situation, being in a whale. Why was he? He is the example of, yes, I left God's path, I disobeyed God, I went a different direction, and now I'm encountering hard times. Jonah's the poster child for that scenario. Yet some good came out of that. We know in the rest of the story, hopefully you know, that the whale didn't digest Jonah. He, in fact, vomited Jonah onto the shore. Jonah got out. He was a little bleached skin tone, but nevertheless, he got out and was able to function. And God said, hey, I really want you to go to Nineveh. This time Jonah went. And we know he kind of fussed a bit during, and he fussed a bit after. But still some good came, and I just spilled the beans a little bit. But let's go ahead and cue up the verses that we have for Jonah chapter 2, if you would. First is Jonah's subsequent obedience. Chapter 2, verse 10, the Lord commanded the fish, and it vomited Jonah onto dry land. Chapter 3. Then the word of the Lord came to Jonah a second time. Same message. Go to the great city of Nineveh and proclaim to it the message I will give you. And different response from Jonah. Jonah obeyed the word of the Lord and went to Nineveh. I'll just stop right there. So Jonah obeyed. So Jonah's period of being in a difficult spot changed Jonah's heart, changed his stubbornness to surrender. He decided, I'm going to obey. I don't know that he knew while he's in the belly of the fish that he's going to get spit out and have to have the same assignment. Maybe he did. Maybe God revealed that to him. We don't know that in the narrative, but he got spit out. God spoke to him again, gave him the same assignment. This time Jonah obeys. So his difficult time for Jonah transformed him to a more obedient one than he was prior. But his difficult time also had an impact on others. And as I was looking at this issue, again, in context of my own personal, professional difficult times, it wasn't my initial agenda. My initial agenda was me, why is this happening to me? But as I was looking and as I was seeing some scriptures, I was seeing the bigger picture. I was seeing the impact that these folks and their difficult times had not just on them, but on others. And so as I was walking through this, my perspective expanded a bit, and I thought about the others and how they were impacted by the difficulty of the particular J character. And then I started thinking about myself and the difficulty I'm facing. What is the impact it's having not just on me, but on others? So let's look at Jonah's narrative and relation to others, how others were impacted by the difficulty Jonah faced. So first we're going to go to Jonah chapter 1, verse 16, are the folks who were on the boat. At this, so this is when they pitched Jonah overboard. Give me a second, if you would. So they pitched Jonah, thank you. They pitched Jonah overboard. The sea grew calm. Jonah's down low. They don't really know what happened to Jonah, but they know that all of a sudden things aren't scary anymore. Sea's calm, sun's out, whatever. So at this, that's the this. At this, the men greatly feared the Lord, and they offered sacrifice to the Lord and made vows to him. So if you recall the details of the Jonah narrative, these guys were not Hebrews. They were not worshiping Yahweh God. In fact, they had a variety of gods, and they were all appealing to their own God to no success, and they drew straws, and that's how Jonah got identified, and blah, blah, blah. So here it talks about the group of men as a whole, as a group, fearing the Lord, referring to Yahweh God, and offering sacrifices to the Lord, Yahweh God. So I believe we really have in this moment a conversion experience with these sailors around this boat who knew nothing about, or probably they knew about the Hebrew God, but weren't worshiping him, hours before. Now all of a sudden, whoa, I've experienced the Lord, and now I realize that he is the Lord. All right, so that was a greater crowd that was impacted by Jonah's disobedience, or the trial he received as a result of his disobedience. Let's go further in the story, Jonah chapter 3, verses 5 through 9. The Ninevites believed God. So Jonah walks through the city of Nineveh, and it says it's a big city, not as big as Jacksonville because we're crazy large in terms of a walking distance, but a big city. He's walking through. He's basically saying, God's going to kill y'all. It wasn't really a message of hope at all. It was, repent, the Lord's coming after you. But it says here, the Ninevites believed God. A fast was proclaimed, and all of them, from the greatest to the least, put on sackcloth. When Jonah's warning reached the king of Nineveh, he rose from his throne, took off his royal robes, covered himself with sackcloth, and sat down in the dust. This is the proclamation he issued in Nineveh. This is the Assyrian king. By the decree of the king and his nobles, do not let people or animals, herds or flocks taste anything. Do not let them eat or drink. But let people and animals be covered with sackcloth. Let everyone call urgently on God, referring to Yahweh God, the Hebrew God. Let them give up their evil ways and their violence. Who knows, Yahweh God, may yet relent and with compassion turn from his fierce anger so that we will not perish. Is there another verse or are we done? I think that might be it. One more, sorry. Next one. Great. When God saw what they did and how they turned from their evil ways, he relented and did not bring on them the destruction he had threatened. All right, so obvious group that would be impacted by Jonah's message is the Ninevites. He did obey, he did go. You might could say, well, did any of that change because of Jonah's defiance and the difficulty he found himself? We don't know. We know that this stuff happened after the defiance of Jonah and the difficulty he found as a result. We don't know what would have happened. We could postulate all day long. What if he had gone initially? Would the same result have happened? I'd suggest let's not think about that because that's pure speculation. We do know by the narrative that he did go and he did preach, maybe with a little more impetus than he would have initially. We don't know. But the people heard this foreign nation, this enemy foreign nation with its own God or God structure, heard this message, and from the king down, they all decided they're going to be obedient to the Lord God, Yahweh God, who relented, who showed them mercy. And we know that Jonah wasn't too happy with that consequence, and he told God, that's why I fled. But as a result of this, so we have in terms of people beyond the person suffering the challenge, we have the sailors who I believe had a conversion experience. We have the Ninevites, maybe even beyond Nineveh to Assyria as a whole, but we have the Ninevites at least spared God's wrath. You can, I think, logically conclude that if the Ninevites and the king are now more open to and in fact surrendering to some extent to the Hebrew God, there's probably less hostility between Assyria and Israel. That's me speculating, but it seems a logical conclusion that the people of, so where I'm going with that is that the people of Israel, Jonah's own people, have now benefited from this storyline, from what Jonah did. And again, the inherent part of the story is Jonah found himself in a difficult time and came through it. All right, so that was my first J. So as I thought about, God, why am I having these difficulties? I started here and I went there like you said, and I'm having challenges is because I left the path. Jonah is an example of, yes, if you leave the path, you can encounter difficult times. You can encounter judgment. You can encounter discipline would be a word we could use in church. So clearly that's an explanation for why one might encounter a difficult time. So I I didn't stop there. I looked at another J. The other J that I looked at, the next one we're going to talk about, the last one we'll talk about today, is Joshua. So Joshua's story is recounted in Numbers. We're going to go to Numbers chapter 14. Again, it'll be on the board if you don't want to turn there. But as we think about Joshua, the challenging time, the difficult time that Joshua encountered was having to walk around the desert for 40 years. Not counting the time that he and the Israelites spent leaving Egypt and getting to this place, walking through the Red Sea and all that, but 40 years later. Let's read a little bit. Again, we're familiar with that, but I want to read the actual words on that. And I'm going to go to my own Bible. Give me just a second to get there. All right, so I'm going to be reading, and the screen will be showing Numbers 14. We'll be reading verses 26 through 35. As soon as my fingers get there. All right, 26 to 35. Numbers 14, 26. The Lord said to Moses and Aaron, "How long will this wicked community grumble against me? I have heard the complaints of these grumbling Israelites, so tell them, as surely as I live, declares the Lord, I will do to you the very things I heard you say. In this desert your bodies will fall, every one of you 20 years old or more who was counted in the census and who has grumbled against me. Not one of you will enter the land I swore with uplifted hand to make your home, except Caleb, son of Jephunneh, and Joshua, son of Nun. As for your children that you said would be taken as plunder, I will bring them in to enjoy the land you have rejected. But you, your bodies, will fall in this desert. Your children will be shepherds here for 40 years, and suffering for your unfaithfulness until the last of your bodies lies in the desert. For 40 years, 1 year for each of the 40 days you explored the land, you will suffer for your sins and know what it is like to have me against you. I, the Lord, have spoken, and I will surely do these things up to the whole wicked community which has banded together against me. They will meet their end in this desert. Here they will die." All right, so Joshua was among that crowd. He gets to walk around 40 years in the baking desert. And as we think about why would Joshua have suffered this, we get a very different answer, an entirely different answer than the why as to Jonah. So I'm going to read, and the screen will hopefully show Numbers 14, verses 6 through 11. Beginning in verse 6. Joshua, son of Nun, and Caleb, son of Jephunneh, who were among those who had explored the land, tore their clothes and said to the entire Israelite assembly, "The land we passed through and explored is exceedingly good. If the Lord is pleased with us, he will lead us into that land, a land flowing with milk and honey, and will give it to us. Only do not rebel against the Lord. Do not be afraid of the people of the land, because we will swallow them up. Their protection is gone, but the Lord is with us. Do not be afraid of them." But the whole assembly talked about stoning them, meaning Joshua and Caleb. Then the glory of the Lord appeared to the tent of meeting and to all the Israelites. The Lord said to Moses, "How long will these people treat me with contempt? How long will they refuse to believe in me in spite of all the miraculous signs I have performed among them?" Stop. All right. So the backstory to this that hopefully you're familiar with is the people walked through the Red Sea, that long passage you read earlier. They were released from the slave captivity in Egypt that they've been in for hundreds of years. They're now walking toward their promised land, the land God said years, generations before, this is the place. You're going to go here. You're going to flourish. So they pass through the Red Sea, and they continue their march until they get to the doorstep, so to speak, of Canaan. And they decide, let's send a scout team in there to survey the land, to survey not just the topography and how lush and all that business, but to see what the people are like, how many of them are there, how fortified are their cities, is this difficult or easy. So they send out a spy from each tribe, 12 total, go in this land. The spies come back, and all of them, all 12 say, man, the land is fabulous. I mean, it is lush. You look at these grapes, and this is just an amazing place. All 12 of them also said, there are lots of people there. And there are big people there. And they have fortified cities. 10 of the 12 said, because of that, we're not ready. This is not our land for the taking. The two who didn't were Joshua and Caleb, who said, as we just read, if the Lord's pleased with us, he'll give it to us. He's protecting us, not them. The people, now the crowd, I'm not sure it's all million are hearing this, but whatever crowd is there hearing this, side with the 10. Side with the expression of fear and lack of faith, and they decide that no, we're not going to go, and they're even considering stoning Caleb and Joshua, one of the 12 spies. So the Lord proclaims this edict. I'm tired of y'all. You're grumbling folks, so enough. You get to walk around the sand for 40 years until all you grumblers are dead. Your kids will come in and enjoy this land I promise, but you won't. Exceptions being Caleb and Joshua. So as I thought, as I was looking through this passage and thinking about Joshua and his difficult time, this is a very difficult time. Walking around a desert for 40 years, that is a difficult time. I mean, I don't know how pleasant the belly of a whale is, but Jonah had 3 days of that. Joshua's got 40 years of walking around the sweltering heat, living in tents and not knowing where he's going to end up, or he is knowing where he's going to end up, but just the dealing with the interim of all of that, a very difficult time. And as we think about why did Joshua encounter that? The main takeaway I got is through no fault of his own. Not because of a lack of faith, not because of disobedience, not because of defiance of the Lord. As I thought of and cataloged Joshua, this is maybe oversimplified, but I consider Joshua's story to be one of what I'll call collateral damage. Jonah's story was pure disobedience. I'm not going to do what you said, I'm going to do the opposite, and I encountered a hard time. Joshua, I'm going to do what you said, I'm going to proclaim faith in you and try to rally the troops. The troops disagree. God's punishing the troops, and I'm collateral damage. I'm stuck in the midst of this punishment of the rest of the people, the stubborn nation who's going to have to wander around for 40 years until the last one breathes his last. And then I'll get to go in the promised land. So as I was, in my moment, wrestling with this story now gave me a little hope. Again, I didn't want to be out of God's will in my particular professional difficult time. I knew that was an option, and Jonah gave a very clear narrative of that option. But then along comes Joshua, who has a similar difficult time, through no fault of his own, through no disobedience. He didn't stray from God's path at all, yet he still encountered some difficult times. So again, as I'm looking at this, I'm thinking, okay, so maybe I'm not out of God's will. Maybe this difficulty I'm hitting, this lack of success professionally in this particular issue is not because I left God's path, because here's a biblical example of someone who encountered some tough stuff, not because he left God's path. So going back to Joshua, as we think about the end result of the trial, we looked at that with Jonah. What was the trial? Why did Jonah face the trial? What was the end result of the trial? And we thought about not just in relation to Jonah, but in relation to the others whose lives were impacted by the trial. Let's do the same with Joshua. So as we think about the trial for Joshua, we thought about what it was. We talked about why it was. Now let's talk about the end result of it. So Joshua now for 40 years gets to wander around, but he gets to wander around with Moses. And Joshua, the passage doesn't tell us here in Numbers 14 that Joshua was ordained to be Moses' successor. There's nothing in the passage that suggests God told Joshua that privately. Maybe he did, but we don't see that in the narrative. But what we get as a result is Joshua for 40 years kind of being Moses' right-hand man. He was that for the first month or however long it took for them to get from Egypt to where they are now. But for 40 years now, Joshua gets to be trained, gets some on-the-job training, extensive though it might be, with Moses, and he gets to see Moses interact with God, and he gets to see Moses' obedience to God, and he gets to see Moses' disobedience to God, why Moses doesn't enter the promised land. He gets to see all that. He gets to see Moses' frailty, his frustrations in dealing with this stiff-necked people, as they are called. He gets to observe all of that from maybe a different perspective. He unwittingly is getting groomed to be Moses' successor. That's what I got out of looking at the end result of this trial as it relates to Joshua. He's not just a poor victim of collateral damage, has to trudge around for 40 years, nothing good coming of it. Much good comes of it. So go ahead and cue up. I'm going to read up here because these are scattered verses. But we see some passages that speak to the effectiveness of Joshua's leadership. If you could pull up Deuteronomy 31, please. All right. Then Moses went out and spoke these words to all Israel. I'm reading from verse 1 and follows. I am now 120 years old, and I am no longer able to lead you. The Lord has said to me, you shall not cross the Jordan. You meaning Moses. All right. Then Moses summoned Joshua and said to him in the presence of all Israel, be strong and courageous, for you must go with this people into the land that the Lord swore to their ancestors. Great, thank you. Because that one cuts off to their ancestors too. All right, thank you. To their ancestors to give them, you must divide it among them as their inheritance. Good. The Lord himself goes before you and will be with you. He will never leave you nor forsake you. Do not be afraid. Do not be discouraged. And then I think there's one. Now Joshua, son of Nun, was filled with the spirit of wisdom because Moses had laid his hands on him. So the Israelites listened to him and did what the Lord had commanded to Moses. And then one more verse, I think, chapter 34, verse 19, or verse 9. We have one more. Sorry, hang on. All right. So there's another verse, it's okay. Another verse later in Deuteronomy says kind of the same thing. So the Lord tells Moses, and that's why I don't think Joshua had any inkling that this was coming, because it's the Lord's telling Moses, then now Moses is declaring to the people, hey, Joshua's going to be your new leader. So not only does Joshua get training in this, not only is he anointed by Moses, but while the people have been under Moses' leadership, they've also been observing Joshua's right-hand man status for much of those 40 years. They have seen Joshua with Moses. They have seen Joshua being the instrument Moses has used on times to organize the people or to whatever their task was at the time. They have seen Joshua grow into a leader. They have seen him as a quasi-leader. So when Moses says, I'm 120, the Lord says, I'm not getting in the land, Joshua's the guy, the people are comfortable with that. They've seen him in that role. Joshua's maybe comfortable is the wrong word. It's still an awesome task, but Joshua is prepared for that. Why? Because he's been wandering around 40 years helping Moses implement God's will to a group of 1 million plus folks, many of whom are just as stubborn as all get out, grumbling every 2 weeks or so. I don't like this bread, and where's meat, and we want water, and it was great in Egypt, all that business peppered here and there throughout this deal. Joshua's lived through it. They've seen him live through it. All right, so that's the impact that this difficult time had on Joshua. So how about others? So if we go to, I'm sorry, I skipped over. You did have, let's read this passage here. So this is at the end of the book of Joshua, Joshua chapter 24, verses 14 through 15. Now fear the Lord, this is Joshua speaking to the people. Now fear the Lord and serve him with all faithfulness. Throw away the gods your ancestors worshipped beyond the Euphrates River and in Egypt and serve the Lord. But if serving the Lord seems undesirable to you, then choose for yourselves this day whom you will serve, whether the gods your ancestors served beyond the Euphrates, or the gods of the Amorites in whose land you are living. But as for me and my household, we will serve the Lord. So this book, chapter 24 of Joshua, is near the end of his reign. And we see by these comments, and I pulled this passage out to help document Joshua's faithfulness to the Lord, till it's in his last breath, but pretty close. And this narrative suggests that as he's ruled the people, sure, he's made mistakes, but as he's ruled the people, he's ruled them being faithful to the Lord. So He was an effective leader. He was anointed as such. He was trained as such. He observed the value of being faithful to God, and he lived it during his time leading the people of Israel. That was what the difficult time of Joshua wandering around 40 years did for Joshua, the benefit, the value that Joshua received as a result of that challenging time. How about others? Again, let's expand our perspective. So back to Numbers chapter 14, verse 33. I read it earlier, but if we cue that up again. Your children, so this is now God speaking to the people in his anger. Your children will be shepherds here for 40 years, suffering for your unfaithfulness until the last of your bodies lies in the wilderness. So we think of that and we think about the impact on the children. That doesn't sound very pleasant, but a long lesson, but a valuable lesson in being faithful to God and being obedient to God. Many times, I won't project you, many times the lessons I have learned, the ones that have been most pointed are the ones that kind of hurt. The ones that maybe took a while to wrestle through. You can hear somebody tell you this is the right thing to do, but if you don't do that and you struggle through it and you come to the realization that's the right thing to do, you learn a lot more than just hearing the person who told you that the first time. So I'm sure these children, wouldn't have wanted a lesson that lasted 40 years, but they got a 40-year-long lesson and what it means to obey God and the benefits of that versus what it means to defy God and the punishment of that. So these survivors would have had a greater appreciation for who God is, what he can do, and don't mess with him, basically. All right, who else? Joshua chapter 21, we're going to read verses 43 through 45. So the Lord gave Israel all the land he had sworn to give their ancestors, and they took possession of it and settled there. The Lord gave them rest on every side, just as he had sworn to their ancestors. Not one of their enemies withstood them. The Lord gave all their enemies into their hands. Not one of all Israel's good promises to Israel failed. Every one was fulfilled. So the people of Israel, the entire people of Israel, not only occupied the land, and there was, again, this is Joshua 21, so there's 20 chapters of them doing this and the battles that happened. This was a conquest of sorts, but God was with them. Recall that he wasn't in Ai because they thought Ai is just a little city. We don't need to really kind of worry about God or muster our troops. Once they learned that lesson, they marched out with God's power, and he delivered the enemies into their hands, and they killed them or removed them or whatnot. So now they have the promised land, and they have it in an era of peace. There isn't anybody fighting back anymore. The people who used to live there don't live there anymore. The neighboring folks aren't picking fights anymore. They have the land, and they have it and can now rest, as we just said. Now they're able to actually rest. And in the midst of doing that, we read earlier the long passage that I read for us out of Exodus 14. Part of what God said would happen when the Egyptians came and drowned was that the Egyptian people would know, not just these guys who are dead and lying on the shore, but all the folks home was like, where's our king? Where's our army? They're not here. What happened? They'll know, and the other nations will know that Yahweh God is the real deal. And so the same lesson's happening here. The people that got scattered or annihilated certainly learned the Yahweh God's the real deal, and all the neighboring folks, the other pagan cultures around them, have learned the same thing. Again, you can speculate, would that have happened if they all went in when they got on the doorstep to their land back 40 years earlier? Maybe, maybe not. We don't know that. We know it happened as a result of this particular sequence. We know that as a result of wandering around the wilderness for 40 years and dying off and all that, they came, and all these things happened. So as I was back in 2002, 3-ish, whatever, again, wrestling with my challenge and trying to evaluate, have I stepped out of God's will? The example of Jonah gives me a yes answer to that. Not that that was me, but certainly that can happen. The evaluation of Joshua gave me a different answer, or gave me a no. You can very well find yourself in a difficult time, one that might last a real long time. Not because of anything you did wrong, but because God's doing something to others, and you're sort of caught in the mix. You're what I, again, call collateral damage. That's what the story of Joshua told me as I was doing my little wrestling match with God back then. And again, I wanted to share that today. Next week, not tomorrow. Next Sunday, we'll do the two other J's. And all this is to get a backstory, a backdrop for when we encounter our difficult times. The people encounter the difficult times of the Red Sea, and we're going to focus on that and take lessons from that. But in my mind, why does one encounter those things? That's what we just touched on a bit today. We'll touch on it a bit next Sunday, and then we'll get into the actual study itself. So does anybody have a question before I close this in prayer? All right, let me do that. Thanks. Lord, we thank you for giving us this chance to gather together for the first time in a long time on a Sunday morning and do a Bible study. I pray that we have honored your directive in doing that and that we will do it safely. I thank you for preserving your word, for giving us here in Jacksonville and wherever people are sitting as they're watching live stream the ability to learn lessons that were taught thousands of years ago. Because you preserved that word for us to read and to learn from. And you've given us the ability to apply such things into our lives today, including as we deal with a pandemic that has seemingly gotten stronger recently. I pray as we look through these passages and the ones to come in this study, Lord, that you will speak to us, that you will give us guidance, so that this particular difficult time and those we will encounter in the future will not deter us from being faithful to you, that this difficult time and those we might encounter in the future will be times that you can use to grow us, to shape us, so that we can honor you and can impact others for you, Lord. Thank you for being here in our midst. Thank you for loving us. In Christ's name I pray. Amen. Thanks, folks.